34% of the children tested in one small Oklahoma town showed elevated blood lead levels, and their grandchildren still refused to speak against the mining company that did it. I know that sounds impossible. It's not. Across America, 10 towns are living on top of documented industrial contamination, and in every one of them, asking about the mine makes the conversation stop. One of these places holds the largest radiological disaster in US domestic history. One has had an underground fire burning since 1962. One no longer legally exists. This isn't about one unlucky town. Researchers at the ATSDR, the EPA's Superfund database, and academic public health studies have been documenting these patterns for decades. What you won't find on Zillow listings, what won't show up in the town's Chamber of Commerce page, is what the soil actually contains. Locals aren't hiding trauma out of shame alone. Some are doing it on explicit instruction. Some because the company that poisoned them also built their schools. And some because speaking up, in their community, reads as betrayal. This is what that looks like across 10 towns. Picture a quiet agricultural valley in central Utah, roughly 500 people. Red rock terrain on the horizon, modest homes, the kind of place where everyone knows which truck belongs to which family. From the outside, Elsinore looks like it simply never grew past a certain point. The population peaked somewhere around 800 and drifted down, calm, settled, unremarkable. What the landscape doesn't announce is what mid-continent copper left behind. In the 1920s and 1930s, copper exploration operations moved through this area, with the particular indifference of an era that had no concept of remediation. Arsenic and copper compounds entered the soil. They entered the drainage channels. The operations ceased in the 1950s, and the administrative record more or less closed the file. No formal Superfund designation, no legally binding cleanup mandate. The contamination didn't make a list, and in the logic of environmental regulation, if you're not on the list, you're not officially a problem. That administrative silence has a physical counterpart. Community health surveys, not formal epidemiological studies, but the kind of neighbourhood-level documentation that happens when someone starts asking questions door to door, have recorded respiratory complaints and kidney issues at rates above what you'd expect from a population this size and this rural. Above average, not catastrophically so. Enough to notice. Not enough, apparently, to trigger a federal response. Here's the thing about Elsinore that makes it different from the towns that eventually got their Superfund designation and their EPA press releases. The silence here precedes official acknowledgement. There's no government document the community is rallying around or pushing back against. The taboo isn't a reaction to a verdict. It's filling a vacuum where a verdict hasn't arrived. The elderly residents who were children during active operations don't name the mine in conversation. Younger residents have absorbed the same instinct without always knowing why. According to Zillow, the median home value in Elsinore runs around $267,880 as of 2026. That number exists in a data ecosystem that doesn't include soil arsenic levels. You can look up the price, you cannot look up the contamination map. That asymmetry is doing a lot of work. The people who know the place best have decided, collectively and quietly, that the mine is 80 years dead and ought to stay buried. The honest drawback here is not just the contamination legacy, it's the medical infrastructure. The nearest hospital of any scale is a significant drive, and a population of 500 generates very little political pressure to change that. The silence in Elsinore isn't dramatic, it's domestic. It's the kind of silence that sounds like nothing at all, which is exactly what makes it worth noting, before we get to places where the silence has a sharper edge. LaSalle sits in the canyon country of southeastern Utah, population around 250, tucked under the LaSalle Mountains, in the kind of landscape that makes photographers drive 6 hours from Denver. The scenery is legitimately extraordinary. The geology, it turns out, was also extraordinarily attractive to uranium prospectors in the 1950s. Small private operators. Not a single identifiable corporate entity, but a loose network of claim holders extracted uranium and mixed metals from this area through the late 1970s. When uranium prices collapsed, they left. The operational infrastructure walked out the door with them. The tailings and the abandoned shafts did not. Decades later, no single responsible party has been formally identified for remediation purposes, which means the legal machinery for forcing a cleanup has struggled to find a target. San Juan County, which covers LaSalle, shows elevated rates of kidney disease and cancer compared to Utah state averages. That statistical pattern appears in public health data. What remains contested, disputed by researchers, by community members, and by what limited monitoring exists, is whether uranium contamination from these specific operations is a primary driver, a contributing factor, or a correlation without direct causation. The science is incomplete, and the community's preference, according to those who have attempted to engage residents on the topic, is for it to stay that way. That preference has a rational basis, even if it's uncomfortable. LaSalle is not an economically diversified place. Its proximity to Moab, about 35 miles, and the surrounding canyon landscape create the area's primary economic logic: tourism, outdoor recreation, and some ranching. A formal contamination designation would reach Moab's visitor economy. It would reach property values. The zip code area, 84530, already shows real estate data heavily skewed by Moab demand, per Redfin's 2026 data, making it nearly impossible to separate LaSalle's specific property value from the regional pull of a town 20 times its size. Isolation is severe. Cell service is unreliable. Emergency medical response times in San Juan County are among the longest in Utah. If the contamination conversation is complicated by incomplete science, the distance from care reality is simply a fact of geography. 250 people, sitting over tailings whose responsible party has legally dissolved into history, in a county where the ambulance takes a long time to arrive. In LaSalle, the silence isn't just cultural, it's been rationalized into something approaching economic policy, which, as it turns out, is exactly what the next town made official. Kadoka is a small prairie town of about 650 people in Jackson County, South Dakota. It sits near the Badlands, close enough to benefit from tourism traffic on its way to Wall Drug and the national park. The main street has the bones of a place that once expected more traffic than it gets. Population peaked near 900. That gap, 900 to 650, tells you something. In the 1950s, uranium exploration swept through this part of the Great Plains the way it swept through much of the rural West. The atomic age needed fuel, and the federal government was effectively subsidizing prospectors. Some of what was found in Jackson County was extracted. Much of what was left behind, shafts, prospecting trenches, scattered surface deposits, was never formally addressed. The EPA has since identified abandoned uranium features in Jackson County. They are in the record. What happens when you try to talk about them locally is a different kind of record. Here's what makes Kadoka unusual in this list. The silence isn't primarily psychological or trauma-based. It's explicit economic strategy. Community leaders in Kadoka have, according to documented accounts, actively discouraged raising uranium contamination concerns in public forums, on the grounds that doing so would deter small business investment. The argument goes, potential investors don't want to hear about legacy contamination issues, therefore don't raise them. Therefore, the community is better served by keeping the subject off the agenda. You can have a philosophical disagreement about whether that calculation makes sense. What you can't dispute is that it's a deliberate choice. The taboo in Kadoka isn't the residue of grief or shame. It's a posture that someone decided on and communicated to the community as guidance. That's a different category of silence than what you'll find in most of these towns. It's managed silence, administered silence. Jackson County is also isolated. Hospital access is limited. Economic base is thin. Kadoka doesn't have the luxury of a large employer, a university, or a medical centre that might provide cover for a more open public health conversation. In that context, the logic of economic self-protection, however problematic from a public health standpoint, has a desperate coherence. People are trying to keep what they have. The statewide South Dakota median home price runs around $317,000 based on 2026 aggregate data. Town-level figures for Kadoka aren't separately published in ways that permit a clean comparison. What the data does show is a town where economic attrition is ongoing and where the contamination question has been formally tabled as a subject. Not resolved, tabled. There's a difference, and the difference is that tabled problems don't go away. 2,000 people. A single active Zillow listing as of 2026, with homes typically falling between $120,000 and $160,000. Those numbers don't capture what's around the town, which is, according to federal documentation, more than 500 abandoned uranium mines scattered across the eastern Navajo Nation. Uranium mining in this part of New Mexico ran from the 1940s through 1986 for legacy operations, with proposed in situ leach mining projects tied up in legal limbo since the 1990s. The mines that are already there, already exhausted, already abandoned, contaminated aquifer systems that communities in this region depend on for drinking water. The ATSDR and the Diné Network for Environmental Health have both documented clusters of kidney disease, hypertension, and cancer in the area. This is not disputed data, it's in federal reports. What makes Crown Point difficult is the mechanism of silence. It's not just cultural reluctance or absorbed community norms. Families with documented illness, families who have lost members to kidney failure in a region with no other plausible environmental explanation, avoid speaking publicly about the connection because current employers in the area have corporate relationships with the mining industry. Talking about contamination in this context carries a perceived employment risk. That's not paranoia. That's a rational calculation made by people who don't have a lot of margin. The Navajo Nation has been fighting uranium contamination cleanup through federal channels for decades. The pace of that cleanup, given the scale, given the number of sites, given the jurisdictional complexity of tribal land, has been slow. Meanwhile, the aquifer contamination isn't waiting for the legal calendar to clear, and the people in Crown Point are navigating a situation where the information that could help them is also the information that could cost them economically. Ask any long-term resident of this area and you'll hear the same thing. The mines were supposed to bring prosperity. Some of them did, for a period. The prosperity left. The contamination didn't. Median home values near $140,000, according to Zillow and Realtor.com data for 2026, reflect a market with almost no transaction volume, one listing active at a time, in a place where the economic calculus of staying versus leaving runs through a contamination equation that the community can't fully speak aloud. Infrastructure is sparse, medical care is far, and the environmental damage is on a scale, 500 mines, that no community of 2,000 people has the resources to address independently. But what happens next on this list makes Crown Point's situation, as severe as it is, look like a precursor to something worse. On July 16, 1979, 11 days after the 3 Mile Island accident had already consumed the national media cycle, a tailings dam owned by United Nuclear Corporation failed near Church Rock, New Mexico. Approximately 1,100 tons of radioactive solid waste and 94 million gallons of contaminated liquid poured into the Puerco River. I know that sounds impossible for something that's never been a household name. It's not. This is the largest single radiological release in US domestic history, and the majority of Americans have never heard of it. Church Rock today has a population of around 175 people, down from a peak closer to 500. It sits on Navajo Nation land, which means the real estate market operates through a land trust structure rather than conventional listings. When land near here is marketed at all, LandWatch data shows figures in the range of $1,000 to $2,000 per acre. There's no Zillow median for Church Rock because the conventional property market barely exists here. What does exist, and has existed since 1979, is documented radiological contamination in the riverbed, the soil, and the surrounding environment. United Nuclear Corporation's mill operated from the 1950s through the late 1970s, closing in the mid-1980s. The 1979 dam failure wasn't an act of God. It was a structural failure that the company had been notified about before it happened. The contaminated flood moved downstream through communities that used the Puerco River for livestock, agriculture, and water access. The cleanup that followed was partial. The remediation was contested, and because the affected population was majority Navajo, and because 3 Mile Island had exhausted the country's appetite for nuclear alarm that summer, Church Rock didn't make it into the national consciousness. Almost 5 decades later, the silence in Church Rock has become something the community has actively cultivated rather than just passively maintained. Older residents, according to researchers and journalists who have attempted to document the aftermath, describe discussing the dam failure as airing dirty laundry, language that frames one of the worst industrial disasters in American history as a matter of household propriety. The disaster happened. The contamination is real. Talking about it, in the framework of some long-term residents, is the disloyal act, not the dumping of 94 million gallons of radioactive water. The practical consequences for the 175 people living here now include ongoing environmental uncertainty, limited medical access, and the specific psychological weight of inhabiting a place whose defining event has been systematically excluded from the national narrative. The Navajo Nation has pursued federal remediation funding for decades. Progress has been made in some areas, contested in others. What hasn't changed is the fundamental condition. This community experienced something enormous, and the country didn't notice, and the community itself has, for a complex mixture of cultural, psychological, and practical reasons, participated in maintaining that invisibility. The largest radiological accident in US domestic history. A population of 175, no conventional real estate market, and a silence so entrenched that the people who lived through it called speaking up a breach of loyalty. Nothing on this list up to this point quite prepares you for what comes next. A town where the contamination had a face, a corporate name everyone knew, and where residents still refused to talk. Clear Lake is the oldest natural lake in North America. That's not a promotional claim, it's a geologically verified fact. The lake is somewhere between 2.5 and 3 million years old, older than the Columbia River, older than most of the landscape around it. Tourists come to fish. The bass fishing on Clear Lake has a regional reputation. What the fishing guides don't open with is that the southern end of this lake has been under EPA Superfund monitoring for decades. The Sulphur Bank Mercury Mine operated from 1873 to 1957 on a 160-acre site directly on the lake's shoreline in what is now Clear Lake Oaks. Mercury, extracted from cinnabar ore, was the product. The byproduct was a contamination plume that entered the lake's sediment and has been spreading through the aquatic ecosystem ever since. The EPA completed a review of its cleanup plan for the site in 2025, nearly 70 years after the mine closed. Mercury doesn't wait for cleanup timelines. It bioaccumulates. It moves up the food chain. It ends up in the fish. The population in this community runs around 1,250, down from a peak near 1,500. The town's economic life depends significantly on the lake, on the fishing, on the recreation, on the tourism draw of a body of water that is scenic and ancient, which creates a specific and uncomfortable dynamic. Acknowledging that the lake is mercury contaminated, that the contamination is documented and ongoing and under active federal supervision, is in direct tension with the economy that keeps the lights on. Long-term residents, according to reporting on the community, avoid discussing the Superfund site because, in their framing, raising it makes the lake and the town look toxic. That framing is worth sitting with for a moment. The concern isn't that the contamination is being misrepresented. The concern is that accurate representation is economically damaging. The mercury is in the sediment whether you talk about it or not. The EPA is monitoring it whether you mention it to visitors or not. The silence is a marketing strategy applied to a public health reality. No specific 2026 median home price for Sulphur Bank is separately available from what the research shows. California's statewide farmland averages run around $13,100 per acre. What's clear is that the local property market is operating in the shadow of a Superfund designation that the community has elected to treat as a private matter. The honest drawback for anyone considering this area, the contamination is real, documented, and actively monitored. The fish consumption advisories for Clear Lake are public record. The EPA is involved. That involvement is ongoing, not historical. There's something instructive about Sulphur Bank in the context of this list. It demonstrates that the "don't ask about the mine" dynamic doesn't require either extreme poverty or extreme isolation. It just requires that the thing you're not supposed to mention be the same thing the local economy depends on not being mentioned. Kellogg's population peaked at 8,000. Today it sits around 2,200. That gap, nearly 5,800 people gone, is the first thing the numbers tell you. The Silver Valley of northern Idaho was one of the most productive silver and lead mining regions in the world for much of the 20th century, and Kellogg was its operational heart. The Bunker Hill Mining and Metallurgical Complex was not a small operation. It was an industrial anchor that defined the regional economy, employed generations of families, and also systematically deposited lead into the bodies of the children who grew up in its shadow. The EPA's records on Bunker Hill, Site ID ID-D 000000187, document lead contamination in soil and air affecting residential areas around the smelter, documented blood lead elevation in children during the period of active operation, ongoing subsidence risks in areas above historic mine workings, and long-term groundwater monitoring requirements that remain in effect. The Bunker Hill complex is one of the more thoroughly documented industrial contamination cases in the American West. The science is not in dispute. The politics, inside the community, very much are. Here's what you'll hear if you spend time in Kellogg talking to older residents. The EPA is the villain. Not Bunker Hill, not the Heckler Mining Company, not the decades of lead smelting that deposited contamination across a region. The EPA, for coming in and shutting things down, for conducting the monitoring, for maintaining oversight that some residents experience as an ongoing judgment on their community's worth. The company that poisoned the children is remembered, in some households, as the thing that gave the town its identity. The agency that documented the poisoning is remembered as the thing that took it away. Median home values in Kellogg run around $116,400, based on area-level data from 2024 to 2025. That price point reflects both the economic reality of a former industrial town that lost 75% of its peak population and the genuine scenic value of the Silver Valley, surrounded by mountains, accessible recreational terrain, a small town fabric that still functions. The real cost here is not just the contamination legacy, it's the ongoing subsidence risk in some residential areas, the groundwater monitoring that doesn't have an end date, and the medical surveillance questions that never fully resolved when the plant closed in 1981. Some families in Kellogg have declined to participate in environmental health studies. The stated reason, in some cases, they don't want to give the EPA ammunition. That formulation, ammunition, tells you something about how the information relationship between the regulating agency and the community has broken down. The federal government's attempt to document harm is experienced by some residents as an attack on the community rather than a service to it. That inversion is the specific kind of silence this video is about. Not ignorance, not shame. Loyalty to an institution that caused measurable harm, because that institution also built the town. Kellogg is still inhabited, still functioning, still drawing some people who value the combination of low prices and mountain terrain. But the 5,800 people who left didn't leave because the scenery got worse. They left because the economic engine that built the town also hollowed it out, and what remained, financially and environmentally, wasn't enough to hold them. What comes next on this list makes Kellogg's population loss look modest by comparison. 300 square miles. That's the scale of the Anaconda Company's smelter Superfund site, EPA ID MTD 000999994. 300 square miles of soil, water, and sediment contaminated with arsenic, lead, and heavy metals. The legacy of a copper smelter that operated from 1884 until its closure in 1980. Anaconda, Montana was built around that smelter. The town's population peaked at 15,000. Today it's around 9,500. The smelter stack, 585 feet tall, one of the tallest masonry structures ever built, still stands as a state park. You can look at it from town. It's visible for miles. The Anaconda Company was not a peripheral player in Montana's history. It was, for much of the late 19th and early 20th century, one of the most powerful corporate entities in the American West. It financed political campaigns, owned newspapers, employed a significant fraction of the regional workforce, and funded community infrastructure, including schools. When the EPA and ATSDR conducted investigations of the Superfund site, they found elevated arsenic and lead in children's blood and in residential soil. Those findings are in federal reports. The contamination radius of 300 square miles is not a contested figure. What is contested, inside the community, is the appropriate emotional and rhetorical response. Local leaders in Anaconda have articulated a position. Mining is the town's identity. To speak against the company that built the smelter is to speak against the grandparents who worked there, the schools the company funded, the social fabric that the Anaconda Company's payroll held together for nearly a century. That framing transforms a public health conversation into a question of intergenerational loyalty. Criticizing the company isn't just political, it reads, to some residents, as personal ingratitude. According to Zillow's ZHVI data for 2026, the median home value in Anaconda runs around $278,859. Realtor.com's data for the same period shows a median sale price closer to $319,000. That range reflects a market in modest recovery. Anaconda is close enough to the recreation economy of western Montana, near enough to Missoula and Butte, that it has seen some demographic stabilization. The Superfund cleanup has been ongoing since the 1980s. Some areas have been remediated, others remain under monitoring. The 300 square mile perimeter doesn't resolve in a single generation. What residents live with in Anaconda is layered. The environmental contamination is real and documented. Some residential soil arsenic levels have required active remediation in certain neighborhoods. Outdoor activity in parts of the Superfund zone requires awareness of what's in the ground. And the psychological architecture of the community, the structure that frames talking about contamination as betrayal, means that the people most likely to be affected are operating with the least access to open discussion of what they're living with. Anaconda is also one of the most visually arresting places on this list. The landscape around it, mountains, valley floor, the remnants of industrial infrastructure, is striking. The smelter stack is a strange kind of monument. 585 feet of what was, for decades, one of the most productive and most contaminating industrial sites in the American West, now preserved as a heritage attraction. The community visits it. The community doesn't always discuss what it left in the ground. And even the complexity of Anaconda doesn't prepare you for the final two towns on this list, one of which is no longer a town, and one of which is barely even a place. 5 people. That is the current population of Centralia, Pennsylvania. At its peak in the mid-20th century, 2,761 people lived here, a working-class coal mining community in Columbia County, with churches, schools, a main street, family homes across dozens of blocks. The population today is 5. I know that sounds like a misprint. It's not. The underground coal seam beneath Centralia has been burning continuously since 1962. The most commonly accepted ignition account involves a burning trash fire in a landfill that sat above an exposed coal vein. The fire reached the vein ignited, and the combustion moved underground into the mine network beneath the town. Efforts to extinguish it failed. The fire followed the seam. Carbon monoxide began venting through cracks in the ground, in basements, in roads. In 1981, a 12-year-old boy nearly fell into a sinkhole that opened beneath him in his own backyard when the ground subsided over a burning shaft. The hole dropped 150 feet. He survived by grabbing a root. The federal government initiated a voluntary relocation program in 1984. Most residents accepted buyouts and left. In 1992, the Commonwealth of Pennsylvania exercised eminent domain over virtually all remaining properties, acquiring, condemning, and demolishing the structures one by one. Street grids still exist, mostly. You can walk down a road with curbs and no buildings on either side, fire hydrants standing in grass where houses used to be. The state revoked Centralia's zip code in 2002. The few residents who refused to leave negotiated individual legal agreements. They may stay until they die. After that, their properties revert to the state. The Office of Surface Mining has estimated that the fire, under current conditions, could continue burning for another 250 years. 250 years. The people alive today who are reading this script will not be alive when this fire goes out. Their children won't be. Their grandchildren won't be. The mine at Centralia isn't a historical event, it's an ongoing geological process that will outlast everyone who remembers the town. There is no real estate market in Centralia. There is nothing to buy. The Commonwealth of Pennsylvania executed eminent domain on nearly every structure. The properties were acquired and demolished. The transaction that ended Centralia wasn't a market transaction. It was a government buyout, administered through the political and legal machinery of a state acknowledging that it could not protect its citizens from what was happening beneath them. The price the federal and state governments paid to make Centralia disappear was the cost of acknowledging that a century of coal extraction had created conditions that no one knew how to reverse. The silence in Centralia is different from the silence everywhere else on this list. There is almost no one left to be silent. The 5 remaining residents are there by legal agreement, in a town that is legally and administratively a ghost. No zip code, no functioning municipal government, no commercial infrastructure. What they carry, whatever the reasons they stayed, is between them. The mine beneath Centralia isn't a subject anyone is suppressing anymore. It's burning in plain sight, visible in the thermal vents and the smoke rising from cracked pavement. The suppression wasn't powerful enough to save the town, but it lasted long enough that by the time the country was paying full attention, there was almost nothing left to save. Centralia is the most complete version of what mine-related damage can do over time. A community reduced to single digits by a hazard that no one stopped in time, in a place where the ground itself is the danger. And yet, even Centralia, with its 5 residents and its burning underground and its 250-year fire, is not the final word on what the silence around a mine can cost. Pitcher, Oklahoma no longer exists, not as a functioning community, not as a legal municipality, not as a place you can move to or buy property in. Its official population is 0. Its peak population was 14,252. The distance between those two numbers is the story of what happens when a community spends decades not asking about the mine, and what happens when the mine finally runs out of ground to give. The Tar Creek Superfund site, EPA ID OKD 980629844, covers 40 square miles of the Tri-State Mining District in northeastern Oklahoma. Lead and zinc extraction in this area began in the early 1900s and continued until 1967, when the mines were exhausted and the operators left. What they left behind were chat piles, mountains of mining waste, slag and tailings from decades of ore processing, composed largely of lead-bearing material. These piles rose 50 to 60 feet above the surrounding landscape. Children played on them. The chat was used as fill material in construction, spread across playgrounds, mixed into the surfaces that kids rode bikes on and built forts in. In the 1990s, blood lead testing in Pitcher produced a finding that the federal health system could not ignore. 34% of the children tested showed elevated blood lead levels. 34%. Not a marginal elevation. Lead poisoning at scale in the children of a single small town, documented by blood draws. Lead is a neurotoxin. It affects cognitive development, impulse control, academic performance, long-term behavioral outcomes. The 34% figure isn't just a health statistic, it's a generational damage assessment. The EPA designated the Tar Creek site as a Superfund priority in 1983. Remediation work proceeded for years, and simultaneously, beneath the town, the underground mine network was destabilizing. Decades of extraction had removed the structural support from a significant volume of subsurface geology. The ground was becoming unreliable. Engineering assessments found that portions of Pitcher were at risk of subsidence, the literal collapse of the surface into the empty mine workings below. The town wasn't just contaminated, it was structurally compromised. The federal government initiated a buyout program in 2006. The EPA, operating under the Tar Creek cleanup mandate, began purchasing properties from residents who agreed to relocate. The program ran from 2006 to 2013. Most of Pitcher's remaining residents, by that point already a fraction of the peak population, accepted the buyout and left. In 2009, Pitcher was officially dissolved as a municipality. It is the only town in the United States to have been formally disbanded by federal action, specifically because of mine contamination. That's not a characterization, it's a legal and administrative fact. Then, in May 2008, while the buyout program was underway, While residents were in the process of leaving, an EF4 tornado struck Pitcher directly. The storm killed 7 people and destroyed most of what remained standing. For the residents who had been holding out, refusing the buyout, insisting that Pitcher was still their home, the tornado removed the structural question. There was nothing left to refuse to leave. And here is the detail that belongs at the end of this list, because it captures something that no contamination report or legal record fully communicates. Some of the survivors of Pitcher, people who lived through the chat piles, the blood lead testing, the federal buyout, and the tornado, still refuse to speak critically about the mining companies. Not because they don't know what happened, but because their grandfathers worked in those mines. Their family identity was built around being mining people. The company that extracted the lead that poisoned the children also provided the economic reason for the town to exist. And for some survivors, that loyalty to origin is more load-bearing than the evidence of harm. The real estate market in Pitcher doesn't exist. The federal buyout program acquired the properties. There is nothing to list, nothing to sell, nothing to assess. The price of a home in Pitcher in 2026 is 0. Not because the homes are worthless, but because they are gone. The land is contaminated and monitored. The chat piles are still there in some form, still subject to EPA oversight. The zip code still exists in postal records, pointing at nothing. You'd think that a town erased from the map by documented federal action because of contaminations so severe that the government paid to remove every resident would generate a clear and unified historical lesson. You'd think the story of Pitcher would be the story that ended the silence. The data points so extreme that the reflex of "don't ask about the mine" finally collapsed under its own weight. It didn't. Some of the people who were there still won't talk about it. Not because they don't know, because knowing and speaking about it are two different things entirely. Pitcher is 0 people, 40 square miles of Superfund territory, 1 dissolved municipality, and the most complete answer available to the question of what it costs, in population, in health, in the ground itself, when the silence holds long enough. A town with 175 people sitting on the site of the largest radiological disaster in US domestic history, where speaking about what happened is called airing dirty laundry. And the town of 0, dissolved by federal order, its children documented at 34% lead poisoned, where survivors still won't say a word against the mine. Both are in the same country. Both are right now. The question isn't whether these places are unusual, it's what it takes, exactly what it takes, for a community to finally decide that the silence is costing more than the truth. Which of these 10 towns do you think the rest of the country should know about by name? Not just the Superfund number, the actual name. Write it in the comments. And if you want more of this kind of documented, on-the-ground history, subscribe. There are more places